The differences between Josephus' two descriptions of the main late Second Temple Jewish movements in his earlier Jewish War and later Antiquities of the Jews indicate the historian's change of attitude through the last decades of the first century of the Common Era. In the war, he limits himself to Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes, presenting them all as philosophical schools of sorts, devoid of any subversive messianic inclinations. Thus, Josephus' description of the Essenes tells nothing about their messianic beliefs, unlike the Dead Sea Scrolls, where a whole set of such beliefs is attested. We already addressed some of these ideas. Three messianic figures, king, priest, and prophet, priority of the priestly Messiah, Messiah as the interpreter of the Torah, the last war between the sons of light and sons of darkness, with the latter doomed for perdition. Focusing on the Pharisees as champions of Torah interpretation and believers in a general resurrection at the end of times, Josephus tells us nothing about the Pharisaic emphasis on the Davidic Messiah, to which later rabbinic tradition testifies. We have seen that the Gospel narrative refers to some of these messianic notions. It does aspire to adjust them to Jesus or vice versa, but mostly does not polemicize with the beliefs themselves. Does it mean that they were not limited to a specific sect only, but rather reflected a broader trait? It's an open question. Anyway, in the war, the cautious Josephus has no intention of dwelling on this dubious, apocalyptically flavored way of thought. In the Antiquities, however, he does not shy away from adding to the list two explicitly messianic movements. First, the Zealots, this Pharisaic subgroup distinguished by its insistence that only God could be the ruler of Israel. And second, the followers of Jesus of Nazareth. Josephus describes the latter in the famous passage dubbed the Testimonium Flavianum. The Testimonium has been long under suspicion of being a forgery or at least doctored by later Christian scribes, keen on inserting into the famous historical treatise evidence about Jesus. However, as we will see later, its basic structure does seem to belong to the original stratum of the Antiquities. What brings Josephus to introduce those quote-unquote subversive, messianically oriented groups into his later account? With regard to the Zealots, it might have been the feeling that 30 years later Romans were already less sensitive to the issue of the Jewish uprising. The same might go for Jesus' messianic movement, or maybe Josephus had been previously unaware of its existence and learned about it only close to the end of the century in Rome, where it was present. We noted that the traditional version of Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews adds Jesus' followers to the description of the variety of Jewish sects. And I quote, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it is proper to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Messiah. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those who loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again on the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day." As with Josephus' dealings with other groups, here too he ignores the possible common ground, emphasizing instead only the outstanding features of the Jesus movement. First, it's a messianic movement. Second, it contains both Jews and Gentiles, the picture fitting more the reality of the late first century Rome than that of the land of Israel in the first half of the century. Third, in spite of Jesus' crucifixion, his followers did not abandon their faith in him, probably nurturing a hope for his return. However, the problematic character of this testimony is obvious. The author here speaks not as a historian, sharing with the reader what he has heard from Jesus' disciples, but rather as a believer who proclaims the Christian truth as facts. Jesus was risen from the dead on the third day. He is definitely the Messiah about whom the prophets spoke. It is even hinted that he is not exactly human. These have been the reasons for dismissing the testimonium as a forgery. The appraisal of the Testimonium Flavianum received a dramatic turn when the Jerusalem scholar Shlomo Pines published his analysis of the Arabic recension of the Testimonium, found with Agapius, a Christian author who in the 10th century composed in Arabic his version of the history of the world, from the beginning till his own time, so-called Kitab al-Unwan. Agapius refers there to the Testimonium Flavianum, and that's his version. Similarly, Josephus, the Hebrew, for he says in the treatise that he has written on the governance of the Jews. At this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous or righteous. And many people among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. Shlomo Pines drew our attention to the fact that this supposed quote from Testimonium Flavianum is devoid of all those elements betraying a stance of a Christian believer that made the testimony suspicious as possible forgery. In the Arabic version, Jesus is portrayed as a righteous man, and no doubt in him being just a man is expressed. Moreover, his resurrection on the third day and him being the Messiah of whom the prophets prophesied are reported not as quote-unquote facts, but as beliefs held by Jesus' adepts. Pines asked whether it's reasonable to think that a Christian author in the 10th century would change the creed-like statements into such neutral ones, and his answer was no. The more convincing explanation would be that Agapius had in front of him such a neutral version, befitting for the writings of a historian. Pines' conclusion was that Agapius bears witness to a surviving earlier version of the Testimonium, before it was edited by later Christian scribes. In the final account, then, the abridged testimony of Josephus, meaning the traditional text minus Christian glosses, may be viewed as authentic. It follows that what is most important to us, that the fact that Josephus in the Antiquities added the description of the Jesus movement to that of other sects indicates that he did view the followers of the man of Nazareth as part of the variety of contemporaneous Jewish groups. Now, it is for us to ask how the authors of the gospel narrative